Hello, and welcome to this talk on women and music history. I'm Dr. Marcie Ray, Associate Professor of Music History at Michigan State University. It is my great pleasure to join you for this week of celebrating the work of keyboard artists. I would like to begin by thanking the festival directors of Piano Celebration Week, Dr. Dino Mulić and Dr. Sangmi Lim. It's a pleasure and an honor to be included here today. I'm sorry not to join you all in person, as I'm a native Texan and have many fond memories of visiting Corpus Christi in my childhood. I've been invited to speak with you about women in music, which has been my area of research for well over a decade. While my published work is largely dedicated to vocal music, this engagement has given me a wonderful opportunity to finally think through an idea I've been mulling over for some time. Additionally, any such project is quite in keeping with the renewed vitality of diversity and inclusion efforts on university campuses, mine at Michigan State as well as Texas A&M Corpus Christi. As part of these efforts, and because in recent time we're zooming in from our respective locations, scholars have begun offering provisional land acknowledgement before speaking to raise awareness about the indigenous lands that our institutions occupy. Now let's turn to our issue at hand. I'll begin with an anecdote from the before times when live music was still possible. In February 2020, critics unleashed their fury upon Yuja Wang for wearing dark-colored spectacles throughout her concert in Vancouver. Norman Lebrecht, as well as conductor Tanya Miller, who later apologized, led the charge. Miller, in particular, bemoaned how the glasses and Wang's demeanor, quote, shut the audience out, and felt like rejection of the audience's need for access to the artist. Other critics, notably after her 2011 performance at the Hollywood Bowl, have accused Wang of being too available to audiences with her penchant for stylishly short hemlines. Mark Swed, writing for the Los Angeles Times, gave this assessment of her performance. But it was Yuja Wang's orange dress for which Tuesday night is likely to be remembered. Her dress Tuesday was so short and tight that had there been any less of it, the bowl might have been forced to restrict admission to any music lover under 18 not accompanied by an adult. Had her heels been any higher, walking, to say nothing of her sensitive pedaling, would have been unfeasible. In this talk, I use Wang's sartorial choices and critical reception as a window into the preoccupation with women's comportment, dress, and by extension morality that have beleaguered female keyboardists from the Renaissance to today. As music institutions invest more visibly in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, it's essential to examine the conceptual frameworks, systems, and institutions that have created barriers for female-identifying musicians in Western classical keyboard performance, as well as to pay homage to the women who have nevertheless managed to secure public performing careers and even adulation. I will briefly explore the careers of several female pianists that represent a range of identities to help bring a less visible music history to light. Perhaps you're already familiar with the career of Yuja Wang. She is known for her fashion sense as much as her technical brilliance. She began studying the piano at age 6, and by the time she was 7, she entered the Central Conservatory of Music in Beijing. By 15, she was studying piano at the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia, and she got her big break when she replaced Marta Argerich in concerts for the Boston Symphony Orchestra in 2007. Her 2008 performance of Rimsky-Korsakov's Flight of the Bumblebee has been viewed over 7.5 million times on YouTube. Let's watch it now. Early in her career, Wang was known for interpreting Russian music, but more recently she has expanded her repertoire to include rich diversity. Her program for Vancouver in February 2020 ran the gamut from Bach and Galuppi to Chopin and Brahms to Ravel and Scriabin. Let's return to that evening to examine the critical reflections. Norman Lebrecht, who didn't even attend the concert, wrote that the attention-seeking pianist came on stage in sunglasses and refused to acknowledge the audience. They grew increasingly resentful. He's a British classical music blogger and former columnist for the Daily Telegraph and former assistant editor of the London Evening Standard, who currently writes for Slip Disc, a blog begun in 2007 with a readership of about 1 million per month. Musicologist Richard Tereskin has called him a, quote, sloppy but entertaining British muckraker. Conductor Tanya Miller also wrote about the evening, claiming that in addition to the sunglasses, Wang performed, quote, she stood up, bowed quickly without a smile, and when she left the stage, she walked with clear body language that shut the audience out. And when the audience continued to clap to bring her back out on stage, she refused. The effect was shocking. It became clear that she was shutting the door on her audience, end quote. She concluded that the audience, quote, experienced the rejection of an artist withholding the permission to share in the feeling, transcendence, and the shared emotion of the beauty, joy, and humanity of music, end quote. Miller even addressed the artist directly, as she writes, Yuja Wang, you must not forget the music is the most important treasure, and that some are bestowed with the ability to share it, and it is an honor and blessing to do so. Wang later took to Instagram to address her fans. She explained that she had been detained at the airport and subjected what she characterized as, quote, humiliating and deeply upsetting interrogation, which left her shaken and her eyes red and swollen. She only wore the sunglasses to hide her visible distress and to carry on with her scheduled performance. What strikes me in these comments is how important Wang's total emotional and physical accessibility is to these critics. It's hard to imagine reading such things about Alfred Brendel or Emanuel Ax. What I will show is not what a woman wears that makes her a spectacle. It's her femaleness. And in the case of Yuja Wang, it's intersectional because it's her race, sex, and gender expression. Asian American musicologist and classically trained pianist Mina Yang writes that Asian and Asian American musicians are often viewed unfavorably in America, where critics focus on work ethic, claiming their musicality lacks artistry and deep intellectual engagement. As Yang puts it, this critical trope casts Asians on the other side of a binary opposition vis-a-vis Westerners. Asians have the technique, Westerners have the heart, the soul. The imagination or the image of Asians as automatons, robots without souls, appears frequently in the Western imagination. Indeed, many of Wang's reviews point to the fact that her performances lack soul. Rick Schultz, writing for the Los Angeles Times in 2008, claims that the interpretation of Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 24 in C minor, K491, lacks a profundity and deep feeling, and he's concerned that she's making a spectacle of herself. And I quote, she also offered her own arresting first movement cadenza, proving she could make a big sound. But this was not a stormy or especially passionate reading. Maybe as she matures as a musician, she will convey deeper dimensions in Mozart's towering dark-hued score. Moreover, he writes of her encores, while it was thrilling to see her quicksilver technique at full throttle, one hopes that she won't make a habit of such a display. Alan G. Artner also centers on technical skill in his 2011 review for the Chicago Tribune, tellingly titled, Yuja Wang delivers a technical knockout. He writes that, quote, the impression it gave was of fingerwork that consistently, even vehemently, surmounted every technical demand, yet ended less with music than with strings of I-can-do-anything effects. He goes on to write of the solo program, quote, each had all the notes, soft, loud, slow, fast, yet the essence of the composers escaped. Lest we think that it's only male critics speaking in these ways, Anne Midget, writing for the Washington Post, uses many of the same terms. While she acknowledges Wang's talent is world-class and that she's even scarily brilliant, she also claims, like the 2020 reviews, that Wang is aloof, even in the title of her piece, which is called Pianist Yuja Wang Dazzles. but at a distance. She writes, quote, "She held the audience at arm's length, striding out on stage with a businesslike gait and bright but distant smile, collapsing from time to time in an abrupt bow that involved her folding from the waist and then springing upright again, and not offering a second of unplanned interaction. Her complete focus on the music was laudable. It just wasn't clear to me, in contrast to previous performances of hers that I've seen, that she was having any fun with it." She concludes that, quote, "It was an impressive and enjoyable recital, but not, on some deeper level, a completely satisfying one." Underlying all of these critiques is a sense of the mechanical and superficial, and overall, Wang's criticism seems to be a good mix of praise and condemnation. To help us read Wang's critical reception with respect to sex and gender, I would like to turn briefly to the 18th century and the invention of two keyboard-playing androids. Mina Yang isn't wrong that American critics focus on the technical mastery and Spartan work ethic of Asian pianists. Rather, I would like to show that there's also a long-standing focus on female keyboardists as spectacles, but not profound artists, which we'll see exemplified in these 18th century automatons. Pierre and Henri Louis Jacques-Dreux, father and son clockmakers from La Chaux-de-Fonds in western Switzerland, built a life-size automaton called La Musicienne, or the harpsichord player, between 1772 and 1774. It features a young woman between the ages of 10 and 12 playing 5 melodies. The father and son team exhibited this work throughout Europe. A few years later, cabinet maker David Röntgen and his father built a female dulcimer player that could play 8 melodies and offered it as a gift to Marie Antoinette in 1785. This one, the dulcimer player, is but 1 foot and 9 inches tall, whereas the Jacques-Dreux automaton is seated about 4 feet high. What fascinates me about these automaton are that they are beautiful and they're playing charming, but they, of course, lack soul too. Their invention raises questions about how closely they aligned with the largely amateur population of middle and upper class women encouraged to play the keyboard as emblematic of their class status and gender. That is, at what level is there a resemblance and where is difference? The first printed description of musicienne, written by the inventors themselves, focus, of course, on her technical precision and the natural manner of her moving. They were clockmakers, after all. Of the second one, the dulcimer player, we have an account from Marie Antoinette's physician, François Lasson, written to the Académie des Sciences. He describes the hands of the automaton as moving with a great deal of accuracy and precision. I suspect that in both cases, the focus was largely on the female body making music rather than the music that these automata played. And I wonder how closely that aligns with actual women at the keyboard, that they were more a spectacle for their bodies than caring about the music itself. What's particularly striking in terms of the automaton is how one commentator on the dulcimer player, Rudolf Zacharias Becker, the editor for Die Sauerische Zeitung, spent significant time detailing how the eyes of the automaton moved in a way to make her feeling visible to the audience. From this, we can make a connection to Miller's disappointment and not being able to read Wang's emotion through the sunglasses. Obviously, this is a complicated issue, and I can only tell part of the story here today. I'd like to trace a long archaeology of discourse around the woman at the keyboard. From the earliest comments in the Renaissance, it's the fact that she's female that makes a performance notable, at least in part. What I will argue is that for some critics, the presence of a woman's body reminds us that we're not actually witnessing Chopin or Beethoven at the keyboard. Baldassare Castiglione's enormously influential The Book of the Courtier, written over a 20-year period from 1508 to 1528, reflected on what made an ideal courtier and court lady. A lengthy passage gets us right to the heart of today's matter, and I quote, Since I may fashion this lady in my own way, I do not want her to indulge in these robust and manly exertions, that is, handling weapons, riding, hunting, and nearly all sports. And moreover, even those that are suited to a woman, I should like her to practice very circumspectly and with gentle delicacy, we have said is appropriate to her. For example, when she is dancing, I should not wish to see her use movements that are too forceful and energetic, nor, when she is singing or playing a musical instrument, to use those abrupt and frequent diminuendos that are ingenious, but not beautiful. And I suggest that she should choose instruments suited to her purpose. Imagine what an ungainly sight it would be to have a woman playing drums, fifes, trumpets, and other instruments of that sort. And this is simply because their stridency buries and destroys the sweet gentleness which embellishes everything a woman does. So when she's about to dance or make music of any kind, she should first have to be coaxed a little and should begin with a certain shyness, suggesting that dignified modesty that brazen women cannot understand. She should always dress herself correctly and wear clothes that do not make her seem vain and frivolous. But since women are permitted to pay more attention to beauty than men, as indeed they should, and since there are various kinds of beauty, this lady of ours ought to be able to judge what kinds of garments enhance her grace and are most appropriate for whatever she intends to undertake, and then make her choice. In other words, a proper lady will be delicate, beautiful, gentle, modest, and graceful. Castiglione encourages women to choose musical activities that heighten these qualities. Indeed, the twin ideals of beauty and modesty for women would not only shape what musical activities were considered appropriate, but many other aspects of her life, including education. For centuries, a musical education was acquired in the Christian church, which was limited to men, white and of a certain class, because of the Bible's injunction that women keep silent in churches. And I quote from 1 Corinthians. The women should be silent in churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but are to submit themselves, as the law also says. If they want to learn something, let them ask their own husbands at home, since it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. Nuns, of course, were an exception, but they were not widely known or heard outside of their own convent. And when they were heard behind a grate to protect their modesty. Furthermore, even when granted access to music lessons in the home, women were faced with a limited choice of instruments, with the piano, the lute, and singing being the most ideal options. On top of that, women were expected to limit their development, as ambitions and great skill might be misconstrued as immodesty. Musicologist Marcia Citron details the many constraints on a woman's musical career. Female musicians were often quite limited in their access to professionalization, since they were largely expected to perform only within the confines of the home, as it protected their reputations. Toiling exclusively in the domestic sphere, however, offered few means to socialize with other musicians and limited means and access to ensembles, publishing, and the learning that comes from musical tours. It also meant that women couldn't really write in the large, more prestigious genres because one couldn't exactly perform a symphony or an opera in the intimate setting of the salon. Networking was just as important then as it is today, and women were largely cut off from these opportunities. Musicologist Matthew Head writes about 18th century music specifically advertised for the fair sex, and he argues that on the whole, this music for women was a means of subtle coercion to encourage them to conform to ideal visions of femininity. It did so by confining them to certain musical practices that kept them as amateurs in domestic spaces, exemplifying the lady of leisure and therefore the class pretensions of an upwardly mobile bourgeoisie. The music is simple in every way. It features simple keys, it's melody-driven with diatonic harmonies, simple forms, transparent textures, and few embellishments. Even the songs remain centered on just a few themes, such as courtship, marriage, and motherhood. Marie Antoinette harnessed these associations when she had her portrait painted, showing her seated at the keyboard. She hoped that this image would work towards the rehabilitation of her reputation. In relation to the two 18th century female automata and the women they represented, however, we might wonder if real women's playing lacks or lacked soul, or if it was the music they were expected to play. Moreover, despite many accounts of young women's uninspired keyboard playing in the 18th century and 19th century, there was an expectation that piano practice would be a way to tame her emotional volatility. Musicologist Ruth Solie writes that piano playing became a means to achieve, quote, spiritual therapy and mental hygiene. As popular writer Augusta Webster concluded sardonically in her book, A Housewife's Opinions, from London, 1878, the better the girl, the longer she practices. The piano was used as punishment as well as for mental and psychological nourishment, and from young girls' diaries, we know that they relished this ambiguity. Perhaps more familiar to some who have used Netflix to ease the collective trauma of isolation during a global pandemic is the Bridgerton series. If you've seen this show, then you are familiar with the character of Daphne, the eldest daughter of the esteemed Bridgerton family. She is shown numerous times at the keyboard where she can express what she cannot say, from passion to rage. Some of the consequences of the limited education and limited ideas is that we have few compositions by women, and female-identifying performers largely performing or playing the work of men. When women play the works of men, I argue, there's a conspicuous discrepancy between the performer and the composer, and it's registered in a gendered criticism that is supposed to distinguish between skills, but rather serves to police who is considered appropriate to interpret men's music. Mina Yang has written about this phenomenon with respect to race. Although Asians have been playing Western art music for over a century and playing it well, there's this essentialist idea that music by natural right belongs to Europeans. It's on loan to Asians on an interim basis, prevails. With respect to Wang in particular, she argues that the performer's body prevents, quote, a pure assessment of a musical performance. For Yang, one of the problems with Wang and her dress was that it has been perceived as a shift towards popular music. And this is not a recent problem for female-identifying artists. As Christine Battersby shows in her book Gender and Genius, beginning with the Romantics, quote, the figure of the genius was used to distinguish between the work of art, appreciated by an elite group of critics, and works produced for popular consumption by the masses. Battersby moves on to Jung, who believed that women's creativity could only inspire a man's productive activity. She can only parody male creativity. The centrality of male composers to classical music programs only fortifies this idea. With all this in mind, we might have a newfound respect for the women who were known in their day. They had to overcome extreme odds. And one of the things that I noticed as I was preparing this talk was the ways in which scholars working to uncover the careers of women in the past, they felt stunned that their enormous achievements had long been overlooked. It's my pleasure to introduce some of them to you today. We might begin with Elizabeth Jacquet de la Guerre, an early modern child prodigy born in Paris in 1665. She was a French harpsichordist and composer and considered the first major female composer of instrumental music. Her father was a harpsichord maker, and her family included many musicians. She made her debut at Louis XIV's court at the age of 5, where she sang and played the harpsichord. No doubt her precocity was exceptional. There was nevertheless systemic and institutional issues that only allowed the most accomplished and privileged women to become visible. Nevertheless, she had enormous support in Louis XIV's court, which likely shielded her and protected her reputation. And she also had the support later of her husband, Michel de la Guerre, an organist. From the age of 15 until her marriage at the age of 18, she lived at the court in the retinue of Madame de Montespan, the king's mistress. After her marriage, Jacquet de la Guerre gave lessons and concerts in Paris. As musicologist Mary Cyr points out, despite the support she received at court, there remained many obstacles. She could not attain a university education, and she could never receive a court appointment. She also had limited opportunities for performance, and women were not permitted to travel with the freedom that Mozart later would. In a posthumous tribute, biographer Évrard Titon du Tillet attests to her great skill and how surprising it was, and he ranked her alongside the other great composers of her day, including André Campra and Marin Marais. He writes, quote, One can say that never has a person of her sex had such talents as she for the composition of music, and for the admirable manner in which she performed it at the harpsichord and organ. Even the composer herself, as part of the published keyboard collection, noted with pride that she composed music of interest to the king and attempted kinds of works that no other person of her sex had attempted. Indeed, it was quite unique for a woman of her time to have published in several genres, which for her included opera, the first for a woman in France, sacred and secular cantatas, sonatas for violin and basso continuo, and suites for harpsichord. At age 22, upon the printing of her keyboard collection, the French gazette called the Mercure Galant observed that Jacquet de la Guerre was celebrated at court and a well-known name in other countries. In terms of her music, scholars have long noted her charming melodies and harmonic variety. Her music is imaginative, attractive, and bold. And might be especially surprising is that a contemporary praised the fertility of her genius. Let's listen to the unmeasured prelude from her Pièce du Clavecin with Francesca Lanfranco at the harpsichord. Now I'd like to turn to the remarkable Maria Theresia von Paradis. She was an 18th century Austrian pianist, organist, and singer. She was the daughter of the imperial secretary and court counselor to Empress Maria Theresa. She became blind between the ages of 2 and 5 as a result of an accident and underwent grueling and painful treatments in an attempt to find a cure, some by the famous Franz Antoine Mesmer, from whom we get the term mesmerism. Her mother, however, ensured that she had a remarkable musical education that included private instruction in piano, singing, composition with Antonio Salieri, theory and composition with Abbe Vogler, among others. Salieri wrote an organ concerto for her, and Mozart a piano concerto, likely K456, and Haydn may have as well. Many of her works are lost, but she wrote lieder, solo piano music, and at least 5 operas and 3 cantatas. In addition to these accomplishments, she assisted in establishing the first school for the blind, which opened in Paris in 1785, and later in life, Paradis founded her own music school in 1808, where she taught primarily young girls in piano, singing, and theory. Unlike Jacquet de la Guerre, Paradis toured throughout Europe, visiting such notable contemporaries as Mozart and his family, Marie Antoinette, and the English King George III. Her visit to Paris's Concert Spirituel was recorded in the Journal de Paris, where one wrote, "One must have heard her to form an idea of the touch, the precision, the fluency, and vividness of her playing." For Paradis, her disability became a focus. In the Mercure de France in 1784, the article there emblematizes this phenomenon. Quote, Mademoiselle Paradis is one artist whom our nation is not able to praise too highly. The gifted keyboard player is truly astonishing. Blind since the age of 2, she has reached an unbelievable level of perfection in the knowledge of her instrument. More faultless, more precise, more polished playing is not known. End quote. The Times of London called her, quote, the blind enchantress. What's exciting is that an opera called The Paradis Files by composer Erilyn Wallen and librettist Selena Mills and Nicola Werenowska was coming together right before the onset of the pandemic. It incorporates a visually impaired librettist, Mills, and deaf director, Jenny Seeley, and it's all about accessibility as it incorporates sign language, audio description for visually impaired audiences, and uses the artistic talents of deaf and disabled performers. Paradis' most recorded and performed piece is her Sicilienne. This recording is with cellist Jacqueline Dupré and Gerald Moore at the keyboard. In the 19th century, we will turn to Clara Schumann, perhaps the best known historical female pianist. She came from a family of musicians and was expertly trained by her father in piano, religion, languages, violin, theory, harmony, orchestration, counterpoint, and composition. She played in the Leipzig Gewandhaus at age 9 and made her solo debut there at age 11. Under her father's strict and sometimes cruel supervision, she made tours through Germany, Austria, and France. She played for some of the most notable celebrities of her day, including Goethe, Paganini, Chopin, Liszt, and Mendelssohn. Her programs and high musical standards revolutionized the solo piano recital. She was also the first pianist to perform many of Beethoven's piano sonatas in public. At 21, after an extended court battle with her disapproving father, she married composer and music critic Robert Schumann. Even as she cared for their 8 children, she continued to perform, compose, and teach. And I have a particular appreciation for that now that, as you can hear, probably that my children are upstairs being wild. And so that she was able to do this with 8 children is for me, a huge achievement. When she became a widow at age 37, she resumed concert tours to support her family. Her contemporaries called her Europe's Queen of the Piano. As Nancy Reich writes in the Grove Music Online, quote, her attention to composers' texts in an age of improvisation and embellishments on the score was almost unique. In her hands, the piano recital became an event in which public attention was focused on the composer rather than the virtuoso performer. I can imagine that as an exceptional woman, she felt a special need to indicate devotion and perhaps even submission to a male composer's work. Contemporary critics responded to this, and I quote, we think we are correct in saying that no pianist ever before retained so powerful a hold on the public mind for so long a period. By her modesty, prudence, and talent, she gradually achieved a veritable triumph. Her compositions can run the gamut from virtuosic showpieces to cerebral and introspective. Here, we will hear Isata Kanemason play the third movement, the Scherzo, of Schumann's Piano Sonata in G minor. Moving on to the 20th century, we witnessed quite a few more professional female identifying musicians and pianists. Hazel Scott was an American jazz pianist, vocalist, actress, and saxophonist born in Trinidad in 1920 to her classically trained pianist mother, Alma Young Scott. Her mother was her first teacher at age 5, and at the age of 8, Scott auditioned at the Juilliard School, successfully, her mother undeterred by the requisite age of 16 for admittance. Over the course of her career, Scott became an outspoken advocate for racial equity. She refused to play for segregated audiences, and she was a rising star in Hollywood until she staged a 3-day strike for the portrayal of Black women in the film The Heat's On. She was briefly the first African-American woman to host her own television show in 1950, but it was canceled after she gave testimony before the House Committee on Un-American Activities. As she confessed, quote, I've been brash all my life, and it's gotten me into a lot of trouble. but at the same time, speaking out has sustained me and given meaning to my life. In terms of her repertoire, Scott is best known for what she called jazzing the classics, which critics felt undermined her talents. As scholar Nicole Rustin Pascal observes, quote, Scott could not satisfy the jazz critics who argued that she was not a true jazzman, unable to perform with emotional transparency and authenticity. Like with Wong, critiques like these raise the question if the problem is the female performer or the lens through which we view them. Let's watch one of her remarkable performances now. Now we'll turn to Argentine pianist Marta Argerich, born in Buenos Aires in 1941. She made her debut at age 8 in Buenos Aires, achieved international recognition at 16 when she won first prizes in the Busoni and Geneva international competitions. Conductor and pianist Daniel Barenboim characterizes her, quote, as not a mechanical virtuoso, only concerned with the dexterity and speed. She mastered those as well, of course, but her fantasy enabled her to create a very unique quantity and quality of sounds on the piano. The critical engagement with Argerich's gender identity is especially interesting. As critic for the Washington Post, Ann Midget wrote, quote, it has often been said of her that she plays like a man, which is supposed to be the description of her strength and power, but which understandably nettles her. Austrian pianist Friedrich Golda, who was her teacher for a time, apparently said that she was part man and part woman, using the outdated term hermaphrodite. And critics asked Gidon Kramer if he was afraid to play with her because she, quote, plays with hands like a man. Let's watch her performance of Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 6. Finally, the last artist we'll consider today is Sarah Davis Buechner, an American pianist who studied at the Juilliard School and went on to win top prizes at international competitions in her 20s. She has performed in every North American state and province as a recitalist, soloist, and chamber musician. She's also toured Latin and South America, Europe, and Asia, and has commissioned and premiered contemporary works. She has taught at the Manhattan School of Music, New York University, and the University of British Columbia. Buechner is currently at Temple University. She's a proud transgender woman and speaks publicly about her transition in her mid-30s. This whole notion of the spectacle of gender and sex has been especially important for Buechner's career because she had to re-debut as a woman. Let's hear a sample of her work. She'll be playing Richard Strauss' Burlesca, and we'll hear just a few minutes of it. With Tanya Miller conducting, I couldn't help myself. Okay, I'll pause it there for the sake of time. Now that you're perhaps more familiar with some outstanding female identifying keyboardists of the past and present, you might be wondering, where do we go from here? How can we support women in their careers? I don't have all the answers, of course. Rather, I hope we can keep these conversations going in our communities and our institutions. In this talk, I focused quite a bit on critical assessment. Therefore, first, as critics and observers, I invite us all to examine our perspective and the words we use when thinking about female keyboardists to ensure that we aren't perpetuating limiting stereotypes. Moreover, we can make more room for women at all levels in academia and musical institutions, as well as promote their artistry in curricula and programming. We can ensure positive mentoring and envision greater equity in all the opportunities that help launch a successful career. We've come a long way. And yet, as we've seen with Wang's performance in 2020 and its critical reception, there remains lots of work to be done. Thanks for your time, and have a great rest of your day.